You don't have to ride Jim Crow. No, you don't have to ride Jim Crow.
Today, issues like police brutality, gun control, and sexual assault are brought to the nation's attention by large demonstrations. Activists looking for a model of effective protest should look at the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. To find the reason for the success of this movement, activists should look into the shadow of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s fame to find Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin's life story exhibits triumph in his great organizational feats and his pacifist influence on the civil rights movement, but also tragedy, because he was forced behind the scenes due to his sexuality, barred by other civil rights leaders from becoming a public face representing the movement. At the end of the Civil War in 1856, the American South was in chaos. The U.S. government attempted to reconstruct the Southern social and political order to include African Americans. However, newly elected President Rutherford B. Hayes ended Reconstruction in 1877 to uphold a promise he made to Congress. The South was forced to fend for itself. Although slaves were freed, those in power continued the Southern way of life through racial segregation. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation between blacks and whites in public institutions, and were upheld by the Supreme Court with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. These practices spread beyond the South into all aspects of everyday life. Although Plessy v. Ferguson claimed that whites and blacks could be separate but equal, the decision enabled the oppression of African Americans nationwide. Rustin was born into a world of legal racism in 1912. Rustin grew up in the small town of Westchester, Pennsylvania, where segregation was the customary practice of many institutions. However, working against racial segregation was a religious society of Friends, known as Quakers. Rustin's grandmother, a Quaker herself, had a great influence on him growing up.
So, his Quaker background really had a very strong impact that, he carried with him throughout his life. He believed in the brotherhood of all people, the oneness of the human family, a commitment to resolving conflict without violence, all of those traditional values that are associated with Quakers.
In high school, Rustin played left tackle for the football team, earning him the respect of many classmates. But his friendships with white kids were problematic outside the schoolyard. In Westchester's Warner Theater, blacks were only allowed to sit in the balcony. When Rustin was arrested for sitting in the whites-only section with his white friends, his career in protest began. He continued to protest throughout high school, sitting in whites-only restaurants and staying in a whites-only hotel at an away game with his football team. When World War II broke out in Europe, Rustin wrote a letter to the draft board stating that he could not serve due to his Quaker beliefs. He spent 28 months in federal prison for draft dodging. This prison sentence brought him to the attention of A.J. Muste, who led a pacifist organization called the War Resisters League. Working for the War Resisters League, Rustin studied Mohandas Gandhi very closely. Gandhi was using nonviolent civil disobedience in order to free India from British rule. Rustin saw that Gandhi's ideas and practices could help the American civil rights movement. Rustin traveled to India in 1948 to attend a peace conference led by Gandhi's close followers, including newly elected Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. After years of developing his ideas of nonviolent activism, Rustin was about to embark on what would be a triumphant career as both an organizer for and ideological mentor of the civil rights movement. Rustin was first introduced to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1955, while King was living under threat of violence from the KKK in Montgomery, Alabama. Rustin's first advice to King was to remove the armed guards from outside King's house, as they were not in the spirit of nonviolence. Rustin became one of King's official advisors. With Rustin's assistance, King directed protests, including the Montgomery bus boycotts, which spread to many other communities in the South.
And so the idea of taking the success of Montgomery and building on that to go to places like Birmingham and Selma and other places in the South to challenge the segregation laws, I think that was largely something that Bayard and Mr. Randolph put forward.
Rustin was able to foresee and avoid mistakes the movement may have made. When it was proposed that black house servants stop work for an hour, Rustin advised against the protest because the inconvenience to employers might make otherwise sympathetic whites turn against the movement. Rustin knew the support of white liberals was crucial because they were the voting base for the politicians that would eventually back the end of segregation. Rustin's commitment to nonviolence opened the doors to whites who felt threatened by leaders like Malcolm X. The zenith of Rustin's career as an organizer came in 1963. A. Philip Randolph, a close friend and mentor of Rustin, called on Rustin to organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. When asked why he chose Rustin to organize the protest, Randolph said, "Bayard is Mr. March himself." Rustin and his team of volunteers had only 2 months to organize the march from start to finish, from mustering the speakers to writing manuals for bus drivers on where to park, to advising on what to pack for lunch so that food didn't spoil on the hot summer day. The march turned out to be a massive triumph for the movement. Over 200,000 people showed up to march. This massive demonstration attracted the media and thus directed the nation's attention towards the civil rights movement. Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech was broadcasted nationwide and became not only the center point of the day, but the center point of the movement. In his speech, King called Rustin's march the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. It remains so to this day. Where Martin Luther King could be called the face of the movement, Rustin could be called its backbone. Though Rustin was crucial to the success of the civil rights movement, he was tragically discriminated against for his sexual orientation, which prevented him from becoming a widely recognized face of the movement. Rustin had been openly gay since he was a teenager and throughout his life was disregarded and sidelined due to his sexuality. Prejudice towards members of the LGBT community gripped the country. At the time, homosexuality was seen as a sin, and a person identifying as a homosexual was seen as a pervert with a weak moral compass. During the 1950s, Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin orchestrated the Lavender Scare. Thousands of individuals working for the government across the country were fired due to their sexual preference. Rustin brought 5,000 protesters to the 1960 Democratic National Convention in San Francisco to attempt to push then-presidential candidate John F. Kennedy and other Democrats to advocate for civil rights. Remarkably, he organized this effective march in just a few days. The convention was surprised by the unexpected turnout and felt threatened by the massive crowd. Although a success for the movement, seeds of tragedy were sown for Rustin personally. Rustin was seen as a threat by Kennedy and other Democrats. Party member and Congressman Adam Clayton Powell made a speech to the press citing Rustin's immoral actions. Dr. King began to fear the protest would be brushed aside. Rustin countered by accusing the party of wanting to disband the march and ignore African Americans' demands. Powell then went to King and said he would circulate a rumor about a sexual affair between Rustin and King if Rustin did not leave the convention immediately. King ordered Rustin to leave and ended their relationship. Distanced from the leadership of the movement, Rustin continued his work quietly. Rustin and King reconnected in 1963 to organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Using the same tactics employed by Powell, South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond made an attempt to disable the 1963 march by slandering Rustin. Thurmond brought up Rustin's morals charges, his brief history with the Communist Party, and his stay in prison for draft dodging. Thurmond called Rustin un-American and claimed the civil rights movement was backed by the USSR. Tragically, Thurmond's statements ensured that Rustin would not be a public leader of the movement. The slanderous remarks made by Powell and Thurmond proved only to be so effective due to the overwhelming homophobia present in 1960s America. Rustin himself was aware of the homophobia and was willing to sacrifice personal recognition for the advancement of the movement. In 1955, Rustin helped write the Speak Truth to Power document, an incredibly influential Quaker foreign policy publication discussed by the country's leading intellectuals. George Lakey, an activist and acquaintance of Rustin, was incredibly influenced by the document.
Bayard said to the group, "I think I shouldn't sign it. I think it will just be a detraction and that more people will take it seriously if my name is on it."
Tragically, Rustin knew that in order for the document to not be dismissed, he needed to not take the credit due to him. Although the opportunity for public recognition was tragically denied him, Rustin would continue to fight for the equality of all peoples. He called for the merging of the civil rights movement and the labor movement to push for the well-being of the broader population. He was an early advocate for LGBTQ rights. Without Rustin, we would live in a totally different world today. He provided wisdom gained through years of experience and study and practice of nonviolent resistance that ultimately made the movement so successful. Rustin knew that the support of white liberals was crucial, as in the end, they were the voter base of the politician that would back the end of segregation. Rustin knew that if white liberals felt threatened, they would not support the movement, and the movement could not succeed without their support. Without Rustin, the movement would lack insight that ultimately made it so successful. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 may never have been passed. Although equality has not yet been achieved, Rustin brought the nation so much closer. When Rustin died in 1987, many mourned the passing of an unsung hero. Advocates for justice today could learn how to further their cause by studying how Rustin was able to further his.